For anybody who's been playing video games for any length of time, you've probably noticed a pattern where there is an obvious lack of information provided to you from the start of the game. From the outer world's unceremonious awakening to the aimless wandering of Kentucky Route Zero, games thrive on the appeal of letting the player slowly uncover the details of the game world. While there is some potential for the player to affect their response to a game through distinct methods of interaction and styles of play, game developers make strategic use throughout the design process with attention to the game narrative, world, and mechanics to influence the emotional response of the player. But how does this act of control take place, and how can we come to understand it? For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be looking into control through the lens of cybernetics, particularly in terms of information systems, using the aptly titled Remedy entertainment game Control as a case study. We'll be demonstrating the ways in which the cybernetic concepts of control and information systems manifest in the game, and the effects they have on player emotion and experience. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, every one of our experiences is governed by the developer's control. For those unfamiliar with the game, Control is an action-adventure game where the player takes on the role of Jessie Faden as she goes on a journey to find her brother in the Federal Bureau of Control. And, true to its name, Control is the perfect game to showcase the ways in which the cybernetic concepts of control and information systems find themselves ingrained in our contemporary narratives. The game communicates with the player, both narratively and through the game world, by never allowing the player to feel wholly comfortable in that world. But how can we go about recognizing the presence of these concepts in games in the first place? Close reading from a literary tradition isn't going to provide adequate reference material to understand the role of play as a critical practice, and something with inherent value. For play as a critical practice, I turn to Mary Flanagan's Critical Play, where Flanagan starts off by explaining that her book investigates games designed for artistic, political, and social critique or intervention. I recognize that while it may not be the main intention of mainstream or AAA titles to offer a social critique, oftentimes they still do. Control is no exception. The idea that games carry beliefs within the representation systems and mechanics becomes screamingly apparent in Control when you come across a man staring at a fridge claiming that it will deviate if he looks away. And while I'm not the first person to recognize the connection between this one instance in the Bureau of Control at large, specifically in Jakob Geller's video where he identifies that this is not an agency that's in command of the situation. This is a bunch of people who have trapped themselves in a house and tried to convince themselves that this was their plan all along. I cannot help but view that as some degree of social commentary, if not critique, about our style of governance, at least in the USA, if not Western governmental practice more broadly. The distinction in perceived intentionality, in perceived value, is something Flanagan and Nissenbaum take up in Values at Play. Though game designers bring pre-existing value commitments to their work, the final system of the game is also reliant on the fact that player perceptions also contribute to a game's values. And it's this perception that not only complicates how we understand the games, but how these games need to be designed to affect and to control us as players. But, okay, I've given us a brief introduction to the importance of considering games in their own manner and the ways in which they have their own value systems, and how players construct value systems in them. For all of this talk of control, what even is it? To answer that, we need to look to cybernetics as a focus, and then move on to understanding control within an information system. For this, I turn to Norbert Wiener, who explains that it is the purpose of cybernetics to develop a language and techniques that will enable us indeed to attack and classify the problem of control and communication under certain concepts. Being notoriously difficult to simplify, cybernetics is then the study of, and our attempt at understanding, communication and information flow in particular contexts. Control, through an analogy provided by Wiener, can be compared to a person controlling a power-generating system who must be able to give order to his machines, and this done by sending appropriately coded signals to their power station. The act of inducing change in the system, whether that's increasing or decreasing power generation, is an act of control. But like an electrical system, control can also be in place in an information system. If we consider an information system to be the series of modifications and changes, controls, from input to output, we can understand noise to be a type of control. Drawing on Warren Weaver, if noise enters the information system, then the received message contains certain distortions, certain errors, certain extraneous material that would certainly lead one to say that the received message exhibits, because of the effects of the noise, an increased uncertainty. And while in Weaver's eyes this increases the information present, where information is directly related to the number of potential outcomes, it still causes a break in what, as a listener, we would consider to be accurate information. Considering the government and governmental practice, what better example of intentional noise is there than redaction? Though we aren't particularly relevant to the main storyline of the game, there are sets of collectible items that you can find as you explore and unlock new sections of the Federal Bureau of Control. And while some of these items, like the phone calls and video recordings, are relatively uninterrupted by noise, the correspondence, case files, research, and records all have the occasional file with blacked out information. And where for Weaver this would allow a greater possibility of outcomes for these documents, and in fact it does allow for more potential outcomes, these outcomes are not all created equal. Information theory, be it mathematical or stemming from the humanities, becomes a necessity to understand this redaction, where questions around control explicitly address the potential influences to or from a system. Information theory is characterized essentially by its dealings always with a set of possibilities, the possibilities that stem from that redaction. And while it is potentially humorous how accurate the relation is, these redaction marks each operate like a small black box. If we consider the dual observer black box scenario posed by Glanville, we come to see that to the observer outside the black box observer cannot be known, but so too that to the black box observer, the outside observer self-appears as another and may thus not be known to it. In the case of the Bureau of Control, the redaction marks create the walls of the metaphorical black box. The Bureau agents making the redaction marks act as the process of the black box, changing the input from the inside observer, those writing the reports, to that the outside observer, in our case Jesse, sees. But to the player, the vast array of literal outcomes only has one outcome that ultimately matters in the eyes of the developer in the narrative. The goal of these redactions, these modifications, these acts of authorial control, are ultimately to build the game world around the player. And in a game world meant to represent a super secretive governmental organization, having hidden information is reasonable, understandable. But in the unsettling and ever-changing world of the oldest house, the location that the Bureau was trying to understand and decided to build their headquarters around, these redactions only further that sense of unease. When you see an anchor floating off in the distance and find the accompanying case files, only to see that what the anchor does to people who interact with it is blacked out, how are you going to feel when you learn regaining control of that anchor becomes one of your jobs? Odds are, you're going to approach it with a lot more caution. Or, at least by the third time you died attempting to gain control. It's these actions, these small details that are constructed around you as a player that operate as the highest level of control, the emotional control the developers hold over you. The presence of control in information systems in the game world are a direct result of the capacity they have over influencing the player. The same systems are at play at two levels. First, within the game and through an understanding of how the game conveys information to the player, and second, the ways the developer conveys emotion as a means of guiding player influence. There's a particularly interesting thing that happens when somebody with some level of skill and ability is engaging in their action of choice. Whether it's a runner who has found their stride and breathing, a chess player operating as much by instinct as logic, or a player in a game moving through the world without a second thought, all of them are operating within a state of flow. That state where there is ability and a goal, but also a degree of challenge that isn't imposing, but offers some resistance. Where Catherine Isbister emphasizes the importance of flow as connecting the player choice and experience, where game designers have unique powers to evoke emotions, such as guilt and pride, that typically cannot be accessed with other media, I instead offer the possibility for the lack of player choice where it normally would be as an equal, if opposite, emotive and experiential modifier. I think back to the time I spent running around in circles in Control. One section of the map teasing you with the possibility of exploration, but denying it to you. And while in the firmly coded manner that it is, there is a distinct pattern that the changing follows, it doesn't keep you as the player from looking through the closing wall at the place you just can't quite reach. At first, it's unnerving. As you walk through the hallways, the walls open and close around you, providing you new secrets while limiting where you've already been. But in the end, it always spits you out where you started. And as you continue through this pattern, as you try myriad methods to slip through those walls, the emotions shift. No longer is it just unease, but frustration at the lack of control you as the player possess. And yes, while I was exploring this area at a time the game didn't want me to, I'm suspicious, convinced even, that I'm not the only one who stumbled across these hallways while hesitantly making my way through the bureau. That hesitancy, that unease, is something Remedy has found a way to build into their game, not as a few select lines of code, but in the very way that is hard-coded into our existence. It's not just the physical, or rather virtual world around you or the story being told to you. They make very specific use of the audio within the game, and as Isbister identifies, this multimodal or multi-sensorial potential of games is what makes them so effective at conveying emotion. Each of the senses that are engaged act as their own information system, with their own noises, their own modes of being controlled and controlling you. As an example of these physical noises which double as informational noise, listen to the hiss voices sounding ethereal around you as a player. And all of the time that I existed in the game world, no physical or narrative decision set my hair on end quite as quickly as those voices. In no small part, the act of existing in the world and feeling like part of the world is what makes these experiences so compelling. While Nicholas Mizer is focused on tabletop games, the 4 key elements of creating an emotional connection with the player hold true for those on the screen. Potentially the most obvious to regular players are saturation and leakage. Saturation and leakage are the ways in which developers use details in the construction of a game world to create a compelling and communicative connection with the player. Interestingly, dwelling, drawing on the work of Heidegger, identifies the way that the player inhabits the game world, and the way that that world will unfold its essence to them. Rather than being shown the entire game world, the complete collection of narrative and mechanical cues, the game allows the player to unfold the game world, becoming increasingly immersed and then increasingly susceptible to emotional communication. Well, the 4th element is perhaps the longest stretch in moving to a game with a pre-constructed character, the potential for emotional bleed, the ways in which emotions are transferred between player and character at deeper levels of immersion, still persists in Control. I can't help but feel the fear and despair that Jessie feels when she expects to finally find her brother, only to come across a broken containment cell, with her name written in what can only be blood on the shattered glass. And it's all of these things working together that allow Control to be so compelling, so emotionally influencing. From the fundamental components of the game's story, mechanics, and audio design, Cybernetic concepts, namely those of information systems and, yes, control, ground the game in a solid foundational framework to convey all of these emotional experiences to the player. You ultimately can take away from the game whatever you would like, but the story being told, how it's being told, and the oldest house itself will do whatever is in their power to control that outcome.